The man sitting across from the detective had kept a secret buried for 22 years, and on this cold morning in 2008, he was finally ready to talk, but only if they gave him what he wanted. His name was Arthur Ream, former security guard, registered predator, and the one person who'd always known exactly where Cindy Zarzycki was. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that sterile interrogation room. Ream leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't nervous, he was negotiating, because even after more than 2 decades, he held all the cards, or so he thought. But let's rewind, back to where this nightmare began, the 20th of April 1986, Eastpointe, Michigan, a quiet, working-class suburb just outside Detroit, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. That Sunday afternoon, 13-year-old Cynthia Zarzycki Cindy, to everyone who loved her, left her house to walk to a nearby store. It was a short trip, 5 minutes, maybe 10, the kind of errand any parent would think was safe. She never came home. Her family waited, then worried, then panicked. By nightfall, Eastpointe was swarming with search parties, police K-9 units, and volunteers combing every street, every alley, every wooded lot. They found nothing, no trace, no witnesses, no Cindy. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Her bedroom stayed exactly as she'd left it. Her mother kept her clothes folded. Her father drove the same routes, over and over, searching, hoping, praying for a miracle that never came. For 22 years, Cindy's family lived in a purgatory of not knowing. Was she alive? Was she suffering somewhere? Or had the worst already happened? The police had their suspicions early on. They had a name, Arthur Ream, a man with a history, a man who'd been seen in the area, a man whose stories didn't quite add up. But suspicion isn't proof, and without a body, without evidence, without a confession, there was nothing they could do. So the case went cold. But investigators never forgot, and neither did Ream, because in 2008, something changed. Ream was already behind bars for another crime when he made a decision that would finally, after more than 2 decades of silence, bring Cindy home. But the truth he was about to reveal, it would shatter a community all over again. To understand what was stolen that April day in 1986, you need to know who Cindy Zarzycki was. She wasn't just a case number. She wasn't just a name in a file that gathered dust for over 2 decades. Cindy was a 13-year-old girl with a whole life ahead of her. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who mattered. Cindy had light brown hair that caught the sun just right, and a smile that could brighten even the grayest Michigan afternoon. She was in the 8th grade at East Detroit Middle School, what we now call Eastpointe, and like most kids her age, she was navigating that awkward, complicated space between childhood and adolescence. She loved music. She loved spending time with her friends. She had dreams, small ones, big ones, the kind every 13-year-old has when the world still feels full of possibility. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were close. Her parents, Ron and Catherine, worked hard to provide for Cindy and her siblings. They lived in a modest home in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other, where kids played street hockey and rode bikes to the corner store, where life felt predictable, safe. Eastpointe in the mid-1980s was quintessential American suburbia. Tree-lined streets, small shops, working-class families who'd built their lives there. It sat just northeast of Detroit, close enough to feel the pulse of the city but far enough to maintain its own quiet identity. It was the kind of place where parents didn't think twice about letting their kids walk to the store alone. Until der 20. April 1986, that Sunday started like any other. Nothing felt ominous, no dark clouds, no warnings, just a regular spring day in Michigan, still a little chilly, but the kind of weather that made you believe winter was finally loosening its grip. Cindy had been home that afternoon. At some point, she decided she wanted to walk to a nearby store. Maybe she needed something. Maybe she just wanted to get out of the house for a bit. It was a short walk, one she'd made countless times before. Her parents said yes. Why wouldn't they? Before we go further into what happened that day, if you're new here, welcome to Revealed Crime Cases, where we uncover the stories that shake communities to their core and shine a light on the victims who deserve to be remembered. We don't just report cases, we honor the lives behind them. If this kind of deep dive storytelling resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And real quick, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far this community reaches, and it reminds us all that these stories matter everywhere. Now, back to Cindy. She left her house sometime in the afternoon on April 20th. She was wearing casual clothes, jeans, a jacket. Nothing that would make her stand out. Just a typical teenager running a quick errand. Her family expected her back soon. 10 minutes, 15 at most. But 15 minutes turned into 30, then an hour, then 2. The knot of worry in her parents' stomachs grew tighter with every passing minute. They started calling friends, retracing her route, asking neighbors if they'd seen her. No one had. By evening, the Eastpointe Police Department was involved, and by nightfall, the unthinkable had become real. Cindy Zarzycki was missing. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was taken from the Zarzycki family that day, we need to step back and see Cindy as more than just a victim. She was a living, breathing teenager with quirks and habits, hopes and fears, just like any kid growing up in 1982 America. Cindy was born in 1972, the middle child in a tight-knit family. Her father, Ron, worked long hours to keep the bills paid. Her mother, Catherine, managed the household with the kind of fierce love only a mother can have. Cindy had siblings who teased her, fought with her, and loved her the way siblings do, messily, imperfectly, but deeply. She wasn't the loudest kid in the room, but she wasn't invisible either. Friends remember her as sweet, a little shy, but with a mischievous streak that came out when she felt comfortable. She could make people laugh. She had inside jokes with her classmates. She passed notes during class and talked about boys and music and all the things 13-year-olds obsess over. In 1986, MTV was still young, and kids like Cindy were glued to the screen, watching Madonna, Duran Duran, and Cyndi Lauper. The Breakfast Club had come out the year before, and every teenager in America felt like they were either a brain, an athlete, a basket case, a princess, or a criminal. Cindy was just beginning to figure out who she was. She attended East Detroit Middle School, now called Eastpointe Middle School, after the city changed its name in the early 1990s to distance itself from Detroit's reputation. The school was typical of its time. Lockers that slammed, fluorescent hallways, teachers who'd been there forever, and a cafeteria that smelled like a mix of old pizza and disinfectant. Cindy had her group of friends. They'd walk home together sometimes, laughing about something that happened in class or making plans for the weekend. She wasn't a troublemaker. She wasn't running with a bad crowd. She was just normal. Beautifully, heartbreakingly normal. Her family lived on Schönherr Road in Eastpointe, a modest, single-story home with a small yard. It was the kind of neighborhood where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays, waved to each other from driveways, and kept an eye out for each other's kids. Crime was rare. Stranger danger was something you heard about on the news, not something that happened in your backyard. The Zarzyckis weren't perfect, no family is, but they were loving. Dinner was usually around the same time each night. Weekends meant church, chores, and maybe a trip to the mall if money allowed. Life had a rhythm, a predictability. And then the 20th of April 1986 shattered all of that. It was a Sunday. The weather was cool but not freezing, mid-50 seconds. The kind of spring day where you could get away with just a jacket. The trees were starting to bud. Lawns were turning green again after a long, brutal Michigan winter. Cindy had been home that afternoon. There's no record of anything unusual happening that day. No fights, no drama, no warning signs that the world was about to tilt off its axis. At some point, investigators later estimated it was around 4 p.m. Cindy told her parents she wanted to walk to a nearby store. Some reports suggest it was a 7-Eleven. Others say it was a small party store, the kind of corner shop that sold candy, soda, cigarettes, and lottery tickets. The distance? Less than a mile. A straight shot down familiar streets. Her parents didn't hesitate. Why would they? Cindy had made this walk before. It was broad daylight. The neighborhood was safe. She was 13, old enough to walk to a store by herself. She grabbed a light jacket. Temperatures could drop quickly in Michigan, even in April, and headed out the door. Her mother might have called after her. Something simple. Be careful. Come right back. Cindy probably nodded, rolled her eyes a little the way teenagers do when their parents state the obvious, and walked out the door. That was the last time her family saw her. She walked down Schoenherr Road, past houses with chain-link fences and cars parked in driveways. Maybe she was humming a song. Maybe she was thinking about homework or a boy at school or what she'd do later that night. We'll never know. What we do know is that Cindy never made it to that store. Somewhere along that route on a street she'd walked dozens of times before, something went terribly, horrifically wrong. At first, her parents weren't alarmed. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Maybe she ran into a friend. Maybe she was taking her time. But when an hour went by, the worry started creeping in. Catherine Zarzycki called a few of Cindy's friends. "Is Cindy with you?" No. They hadn't seen her. Ron got in the car and drove the route to the store, scanning every sidewalk, every alley. Maybe she'd fallen. Maybe she'd hurt herself. Maybe there was a logical explanation. But there wasn't. By 6 p.m., the Zarzyckis were frantic. Ron drove the route again. Catherine called everyone she could think of. Neighbors started looking. Friends joined the search. Nothing. By 7 p.m., they called the Eastpointe Police Department. At first, the response was measured. Teenagers run away sometimes. Maybe she'd had a fight with her parents and didn't want to come home. Maybe she was just acting out. But the Zarzyckis knew. This wasn't like Cindy. She didn't run away. She didn't cause trouble. Something was wrong. By nightfall, the police took it seriously. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They asked if anyone had seen a 13-year-old girl. Light brown hair, jeans, jacket. They retraced her likely route. They checked the store. They checked nearby parks, playgrounds, schools. Nothing. It was as if Cindy Zarzycki had simply vanished into thin air. The first 24 hours of a missing person case are critical. Every detective knows this. Every parent dreads it. Because the longer someone is missing, the smaller the chances of a happy ending become. By Monday morning, Cindy had been gone for nearly 16 hours. The story hit the local news. Her school was buzzing with rumors and fear. Teachers whispered in hallways. Students clutched their backpacks a little tighter. The Zarzyckis didn't sleep. They couldn't. Every time the phone rang, they jumped. Every time a car pulled up outside, they ran to the window. Was it her? Was it news? Was it the call every parent prays for, or the one they dread most? Days turned into a week. The search intensified. Volunteers combed through wooded areas, abandoned buildings, drainage ditches. They put up flyers on every telephone pole, every storefront window. Cindy's face stared out from those posters, young, smiling, frozen in time. Missing, Cynthia Zarzycki, age 13, last seen the 20th of April 1986. But despite all the effort, all the manpower, all the desperate hope, there was no trace of Cindy. No witnesses who remembered seeing her that day. No physical evidence. No leads. It was as if she'd been erased. But someone knew. Someone out there knew exactly what had happened to Cindy Zarzycki, and that someone was watching the search unfold with a secret he had no intention of sharing. Not yet. When a child goes missing, time fractures. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like days. And every second that ticks by without answers is another second of unbearable torture for the family left behind. For Ron and Catherine Zarzycki, the first 48 hours after Cindy disappeared were a waking nightmare. On the morning of the 21st of April, 1986, less than 24 hours after Cindy vanished, the Eastpointe Police Department officially launched a full-scale missing person investigation. Detectives arrived at the Zarzycki home to conduct interviews, gather information, and try to piece together Cindy's last known movements. They asked the questions every parent dreads. Did Cindy have any reason to run away? Was she having problems at school? Did she have a boyfriend? Had she been acting differently lately? Catherine answered through tears. Ron's hands shook as he tried to stay composed. No. Cindy was a good kid. She wasn't in trouble. She didn't run away. She wouldn't do this. But detectives have to ask. They have to rule out the possibilities before they can focus on the probabilities. And the probability, the one no one wanted to say out loud, was that something terrible had happened. The police brought in search dogs, German shepherds with their noses to the ground, handlers gripping leashes tightly, hoping for a scent, a trail, anything that could lead them to Cindy. The dogs picked up nothing. Patrol officers canvassed the neighborhood, going door to door, asking the same questions over and over. Did you see anything unusual on Sunday afternoon? Did you see a young girl walking alone? Did you notice any unfamiliar cars in the area? Most people shook their heads. They'd heard about the missing girl. Word traveled fast in a town like Eastpointe, but no one had seen anything. Or if they had, they didn't realize it mattered at the time. One neighbor remembered seeing a man in a car near Shonher Road around the time Cindy disappeared, but the description was vague. White male, middle-aged, older sedan. It could have been anyone. Still, detectives wrote it down. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. By Monday afternoon, the local media picked up the story. Detroit's television stations ran segments during the evening news. Cindy's school photo appeared on screens across southeastern Michigan. 13-year-old Cindy Zarzycki has been missing since Sunday evening. Police are asking anyone with information to please come forward. The Zarzyckis sat in their living room, numb, watching their daughter's face on TV. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The community of Eastpointe rallied. Neighbors organized search parties. Volunteers, some who knew the family. Others who were just horrified by the thought of a missing child, showed up in droves. They searched parks. They searched alleys. They searched vacant lots and wooded areas. They waded through muddy ditches and poked through abandoned buildings. They called Cindy's name until their voices went hoarse. Cindy, Cindy, can you hear us? Silence. Local businesses printed flyers. Cindy's face was everywhere, taped to windows, stapled to telephone poles, handed out at gas stations and grocery stores. Missing. Cindy Zarzycki, 13 years old. Last seen the 20th of April, 1986, near Shonher Road, Eastpointe. If you have any information, please contact Eastpointe Police. The Zarzyckis couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time the phone rang, Catherine lunged for it, praying it was anyone with news. Sometimes it was a well-meaning neighbor offering support. Sometimes it was a reporter asking for a statement. Sometimes it was a crank call, someone cruel enough to prey on a grieving family. Those calls were the worst. Ron spent his days driving. He drove the same streets over and over, searching every face, every shadow, every possibility. What if she was out there, hurt, unable to get home? What if she was calling for them, and they couldn't hear her? Catherine stayed by the phone. She couldn't leave. What if Cindy called? What if she came home and no one was there? The other Zarzycki children were terrified. Their sister was gone. Their parents were falling apart, and no one could tell them when or if things would be okay again. At school, Cindy's classmates were in shock. Teachers tried to maintain normalcy, but how could they? One of their own was missing. An empty desk sat in every classroom Cindy had been in. Friends cried in bathrooms. Rumors spread like wildfire. I heard she ran away. I heard someone took her. I heard she's already dead. Kids are cruel, even when they don't mean to be. But mostly, they were scared. If it could happen to Cindy, it could happen to anyone. Parents in Eastpointe started walking their kids to school. They stopped letting them ride bikes alone. They locked doors that used to stay open. The sense of safety that had defined this community evaporated overnight. By the end of the first week, the search had expanded beyond Eastpointe. Police in neighboring cities were alerted. Hospitals were contacted. Homeless shelters were checked. Morgues were notified. Every lead, no matter how thin, was followed. A woman called in saying she'd seen a girl matching Cindy's description at a rest stop outside Flint. Police drove there immediately. It wasn't her. A man reported seeing a suspicious vehicle near a wooded area in Macomb County. Detectives combed the area. Found nothing. Another tip came in about a girl matching Cindy's description seen getting into a car near Detroit. Officers tracked it down. Dead end. Each false lead was another devastating blow. Ron and Catherine held a press conference, standing in front of microphones with trembling voices, begging for their daughter's safe return. Please, Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. If someone has her, please let her go. We just want her home. We just want to know she's okay. Ron stood beside her, jaw clenched, trying to hold it together. Cindy, if you can hear this, we love you. We're not angry. Just come home. Please, baby. Just come home. The footage aired on every local news station. The image of two broken parents pleading for their child haunted viewers across Michigan. But Cindy didn't come home. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then a month. The search parties grew smaller. The news coverage became less frequent. The flyers on telephone poles started to fade, weathered by rain and wind. But the Zarzyckis never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somehow, some way, they'd find their daughter. The police, however, were beginning to accept a darker reality. Cindy Zarzycki wasn't missing. She was gone, and whoever took her had done a very, very good job of covering his tracks. But not good enough, because even in those first chaotic weeks, one name kept surfacing in the investigation, a name that would haunt this case for the next 22 years. Arthur Ream. Arthur Ream wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. By the time Cindy Zarzycki disappeared in April 1986, Ream's name was already in police databases. His face was already familiar to officers who worked the streets of Macomb County, and his behavior had already raised more red flags than anyone could count. He was 38 years old when Cindy vanished, a former security guard with a stocky build, thinning hair, and a face that could blend into a crowd. He wasn't intimidating at first glance. He didn't look like a monster. But then again, monsters rarely do. Arthur Ream was born and raised in Michigan. He'd spent most of his life in the working-class suburbs surrounding Detroit, places like Warren, Sterling Heights, and Eastpointe. He knew these neighborhoods intimately. Every side street, every wooded lot, every quiet corner where no one was watching. He worked a series of odd jobs over the years: security guard, maintenance worker, handyman. Jobs that gave him access, jobs that allowed him to move around unnoticed, jobs where people didn't ask too many questions. But it was his extracurricular activities that made him dangerous. Arthur Ream had a documented, disturbing obsession with young girls. In the early 1980 seconds, he'd been questioned multiple times by police for suspicious behavior around schools and parks. Parents had reported seeing him loitering near playgrounds, watching children. Teachers had noticed him sitting in his car outside school grounds, just watching. He always had an excuse. I was waiting for someone. I was just taking a break. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And technically, he wasn't. Sitting in a car isn't illegal. Watching kids play from a public street isn't a crime. But it was enough to make him known. Enough to make officers take note. Ream had a way of talking to investigators that set their teeth on edge. He was calm. Almost too calm. He'd answer questions with just enough detail to seem cooperative, but never enough to be helpful. He'd smile at the wrong moments, make jokes that didn't land. There was something off about him, something that made your skin crawl even if you couldn't quite put your finger on why. When Cindy Zarzycki disappeared, detectives working the case started building a list of potential suspects. They cross-referenced known offenders in the area. They looked at anyone with a history of violence, sexual offenses, or suspicious behavior around children. Arthur Ream's name came up almost immediately. He lived less than 2 miles from where Cindy was last seen. He had no solid alibi for the afternoon of the 20th of April, 1986, and his van, a nondescript older model that he used for his handyman jobs, had been spotted in the area around the time Cindy disappeared. 3 days after Cindy vanished, detectives showed up at Ream's door. He answered calmly, almost as if he'd been expecting them. "Can we ask you a few questions, Mr. Ream?" "Sure." "What's this about?" They asked him where he was on Sunday, April 20th. He thought for a moment, scratched his head, said he couldn't remember exactly. Maybe he was working, maybe he was home. Hard to say. Did he know Cynthia Zarzycki? No. Never heard of her. Had he been near Schoenherr Road that day? Maybe. He drove around a lot for work. Could have been. The detectives didn't have enough to arrest him. Not yet. But they had enough to keep him on their radar. Over the following weeks, they brought Ream in for multiple interviews. Each time, his story shifted slightly. Not enough to be an outright lie, but enough to raise suspicion. He'd remember a detail he hadn't mentioned before. He'd contradict something he'd said in a previous interview. Detectives tried different tactics. They were friendly. They were confrontational. They played good cop, bad cop. They showed him photos of Cindy and asked if seeing her face jogged his memory. Ream barely glanced at the photos. Nope, don't know her. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker, a tell. Detectives who interviewed him swear they saw at a brief moment where his mask slipped. He knew something. Investigators started digging deeper into Ream's background. What they found was chilling. In 1974, 12 years before Cindy disappeared, Ream had been arrested for accosting a minor. He'd approached a young girl in a park, tried to lure her into his car. The girl ran. A witness called the police. Ream was arrested, but the case was ultimately dropped due to lack of evidence. In 1978, another incident. A teenage girl reported that a man matching Ream's description had followed her home from school. She said he tried to talk to her, asked her if she needed a ride. She refused and ran inside. Police questioned Ream. He denied everything. In 1982, police found Ream parked near a playground in Warren, Michigan. He had binoculars. When asked what he was doing, he claimed he was birdwatching. At a playground, in the middle of a residential neighborhood, with no birds in sight. Each incident on its own might have been explainable, but together, they painted a disturbing picture. Arthur Ream was a predator, and he'd been operating in plain sight for years. Detectives working Cindy's case were convinced Ream was involved. Every instinct told them he was their guy. But instinct isn't evidence, and evidence was exactly what they didn't have. No body, no witnesses, no physical proof tying Ream to Cindy's disappearance. They searched his van, found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, no trace of Cindy. They searched his home. Again, nothing. They followed him, watched him, waited for him to slip up. Ream knew he was being watched, and he was careful, meticulous even. He went about his daily routine without a hint of guilt. He went to work, he ran errands, he acted like a man with nothing to hide. But at night, he'd drive. Long, aimless drives through the suburbs, down back roads, past wooded areas, almost as if he were checking on something. Detectives followed him on those drives. They noted the routes he took, the places he stopped, the areas he seemed drawn to. One location came up repeatedly. A wooded area near Macomb Township, about 20 miles north of Eastpointe. Ream would park his van, sit there for a while, then drive away. Investigators searched that area multiple times. They brought in cadaver dogs. They combed through thick underbrush and dense woods. They found nothing, but they didn't stop watching Arthur Ream, because if there's one thing seasoned detectives know, it's this: guilty men eventually make mistakes. Ream, however, seemed to be the exception. He didn't crack under interrogation. He didn't confess. He didn't slip up, and without concrete evidence, prosecutors couldn't charge him with anything. In late 1986, after months of investigation, the case against Arthur Ream stalled. Detectives were furious. They knew he was responsible for Cindy's disappearance. But knowing and proving are two very different things. Ream walked free. He went back to his life, back to his odd jobs, back to blending into the background. But the detectives working Cindy's case made him a promise even if he never heard it. We're not done with you, Arthur. Not by a long shot. Because in the world of law enforcement, some cases never truly go cold. Some suspects are never truly off the hook. Arthur Ream's name would stay in that file, at the top of the list, circled, highlighted, waiting. And for the next 22 years, even as the case faded from public attention, even as Cindy's flyers yellowed and tore, even as the world moved on, one fact remained constant. Arthur Ream knew where Cindy was, and one day, he'd tell them. He just didn't know it yet. Before we go any further, I need to pause for just a second. This case gets even more twisted from here. We're about to dive into 22 years of frustration, dead ends, and a family that refused to give up hope even when it seemed impossible. But I want to take a moment to say if you're finding this story as gripping and heartbreaking as I did while researching it, please hit that like button. I know it sounds simple, but it genuinely helps. Every like tells YouTube that this story matters, that Cindy's story deserves to be heard, and it pushes this video to more people who care about true crime and justice. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. What time is it where you are right now? Are you doing a late-night deep dive into true crime before bed? Are you listening to this on your morning commute? Maybe you're folding laundry or cooking dinner while this plays in the background. Drop the time in the comments. I love seeing when and where this community tunes in. It reminds me that no matter where we are in the world, stories like Cindy's connect us. They remind us why justice matters, why we can't forget the victims, why we keep digging, keep asking questions, keep demanding answers. All right, back to the story. Because while Arthur Ream walked free in 1986, thinking he'd gotten away with it, the investigators working Cindy's case were far from finished. They knew who he was, they knew what he'd done, and they were going to spend the next 2 decades making absolutely sure that when the opportunity came, and it would come, they'd be ready. What followed was one of the longest, most agonizing cold case investigations in Michigan history. Let's talk about those 22 years. In the months following Cindy's disappearance, The Eastpointe Police Department and the Macomb County Sheriff's Office poured every available resource into finding her. Detectives worked overtime. They chased down every lead, no matter how unlikely. They re-interviewed witnesses. They re-examined evidence. They refused to let this case become just another statistic. But the harsh reality of police work is this: without evidence, there's only so much you can do. And evidence was exactly what they didn't have. No body, no crime scene, no murder weapon, no witnesses who could definitively place Arthur Ream with Cindy on the 20th of April 1986. What they did have was circumstantial, suspicious, compelling to investigators, but not enough for a prosecutor to take to trial. Still, detectives kept the pressure on Ream. They brought him in for questioning again in June 1986, then again in August. Each time, Ream showed up calmly, answered their questions with the same frustrating vagueness, and walked out a free man. Where were you on April 20th between 3 and 6 p.m.? Like I said before, I don't really remember. Probably home. Maybe driving around for work. We have a witness who says they saw your van near Shunher Road that afternoon. I drive all over. Could have been me. Could have been someone else with a similar van. Do you know what happened to Cindy Zarzycki? No idea. I told you I don't know her. The interviews were maddening. Ream never lawyered up, which was unusual. Most guilty people invoke their right to an attorney immediately. But Ream seemed to enjoy the dance. He'd sit across from detectives, arms folded, that faint smirk playing at his lips. He knew they had nothing solid, and he knew they knew he was guilty. It was a game, and for now, Ream was winning. Detectives decided to take a different approach. They focused on building a timeline of Ream's movements in the days before and after Cindy disappeared. They pulled his work records. They talked to his employer, his co-workers, anyone who might have seen him that week. What they found was troubling. Ream had taken time off work on April 21st, the day after Cindy vanished. He'd called in, said he was sick, but a neighbor reported seeing him leave his house early that morning in his van, carrying a shovel and some tarps. When detectives asked Ream about it, he shrugged. I was doing some work on a buddy's property, needed to move some dirt. Which buddy? Can't remember his name. Just some guy I know. Convenient. They asked if they could search his van again. Ream said sure. He had nothing to hide. Forensic techs went over that van with a fine-toothed comb. They vacuumed fibers. They swabbed for blood. They checked under the seats, in the wheel wells, in every crevice. Nothing. Either the van had been meticulously cleaned, or Cindy had never been in it. But detectives didn't believe that for a second. They expanded their search. They asked permission to search Ream's home again. He agreed, probably because he knew they wouldn't find anything. And they didn't. His house was messy but not suspicious. No signs of a struggle, no hidden spaces, no evidence of a crime. Ream was careful, methodical. He'd thought this through. Detectives also looked into other potential suspects. They had to. Even though every instinct screamed that Ream was their guy, they couldn't afford to ignore other possibilities. There was a registered sex offender living 3 miles from Cindy's house. Detectives interviewed him. His alibi checked out. He'd been at work the day Cindy disappeared, verified by multiple witnesses. Another name surfaced, a man who'd been seen following teenage girls in the area a few weeks before Cindy vanished. Police tracked him down. Turned out he'd moved to Ohio in early April. He wasn't involved. A third suspect, a drifter who'd been spotted in Eastpointe around the time of the disappearance, was brought in for questioning. He had no connection to Cindy, no motive, no opportunity. He was ruled out. Every trail led back to Arthur Ream. But here's the brutal truth about the American justice system. Suspicion isn't enough. Circumstantial evidence isn't enough. Even a detective's gut instinct honed over decades of experience isn't enough. You need proof. Hard, undeniable proof. And without Cindy's body, there was no proof. Prosecutors made it clear. Bring us something concrete, and we'll charge him. But right now, we'd lose in court. A defense attorney would tear this apart. It was a devastating blow. Detectives knew Ream had killed Cindy. They knew he'd buried her somewhere. They knew he was walking around free, while the Zarzycki family was drowning in grief. But knowing isn't enough. So they did the only thing they could do. They kept watching him. Surveillance became a regular part of the investigation. Unmarked cars followed Ream to work, to the grocery store, to gas stations. Detectives noted where he went, who he talked to, any deviation from his normal routine, and those late-night drives. They kept tracking those too. Ream continued to visit that wooded area in Macomb Township, not every night, but regularly enough to be noticeable. He'd park, sit in his van for 20, 30 minutes, then leave. Each time, detectives would search the area after he left. Each time, they found nothing. It was psychological torture. For the investigators, for Cindy's family, for everyone who knew the truth but couldn't prove it, Ron Zarzycki started his own investigation. He'd drive around, looking for his daughter, hoping for a miracle. Sometimes he'd end up in the same areas Ream frequented. Once, he even confronted Ream in a grocery store parking lot. "Where is she? Where's my daughter?" Ream stared at him, expressionless. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ron lunged. Friends held him back. Police were called. Ream didn't press charges. He didn't have to. He was already winning. Catherine Zarzycki visited psychics. She chased down rumors. She followed up on every possible sighting, no matter how far-fetched. A woman in Indiana thought she saw Cindy. Catherine drove 5 hours. It wasn't her. Someone called saying Cindy was alive and living in California. Catherine begged police to investigate. They did. Another dead end. The emotional toll was unbearable. But Catherine couldn't stop. Stopping meant accepting that Cindy was gone. And she wasn't ready for that. By late 1987, more than a year after Cindy disappeared, the active investigation began to slow down. Not because detectives gave up, but because there was nowhere left to go. They'd exhausted every lead, interviewed every possible witness, searched every location that made sense. Arthur Ream remained free. And Cindy remained missing. The case was officially classified as a cold case in 1988. But cold doesn't mean closed. The file stayed open. Detectives rotated off the case, but new ones picked it up. Cindy's name stayed in the system, and Arthur Ream's name stayed right there beside it, flagged, noted, never forgotten. Because here's something most people don't realize about cold cases. They don't go away. Detectives don't forget. Families don't move on. They wait. They wait for new technology, new witnesses, new evidence, a confession. They wait for the guilty to make a mistake. And in Arthur Ream's case, that wait would last 22 years. 22 years of Cindy's family living in agony. 22 years of Ream walking free, living his life, going to work, acting like he hadn't destroyed an entire family. 22 years of detectives staring at that file, knowing the truth, waiting for the chance to finally prove it. It's easy to say the system failed. And, in many ways, it did. But the detectives who worked Cindy's case never stopped fighting. They kept her case alive when it would have been easier to let it fade. They kept Arthur Ream's name on their radar when he thought he'd gotten away with it, because they made a promise. To Cindy, to her family, to themselves. We will find the truth, no matter how long it takes. And eventually, they would. But first, they'd have to endure over 2 decades of heartbreak, frustration, and waiting. This is the story of those years. 22 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 22 years of not knowing. 22 years of waking up every single day and wondering if today would be the day you finally got answers. 22 years of birthdays that passed without celebration, holidays that felt hollow, and ordinary moments that were anything but ordinary because someone was missing. For the Zarzycki family, those 22 years were a living hell. Catherine never redecorated Cindy's room. She couldn't. Cindy's clothes still hung in the closet. Her posters were still on the walls. Her bed was still made, waiting for her to come home. Every year on Cindy's birthday, May 19th, Catherine would bake a cake. She'd light candles. She'd sing quietly, tears streaming down her face. And then she'd blow out the candles alone. Cindy would have turned 14 inches 1,987, then 15, then 16, 18, 21, 25, 30. With each passing year, the girl Catherine remembered became harder to hold on to. What would Cindy look like now? Would she have gone to college? Would she have gotten married? Had kids of her own? These weren't just hypothetical questions. They were the daily torture of a mother who had her child stolen from her and never got closure. Ron dealt with his grief differently. He threw himself into work, trying to outrun the pain. But at night, when the house was quiet, he'd drive. The same streets, the same route Cindy might have walked. Looking, always looking. He kept every newspaper clipping about Cindy's case, every article, every mention. He stored them in boxes in the garage, a paper trail of his daughter's disappearance and the investigation that couldn't solve it. Cindy's siblings grew up in the shadow of her absence. They had to navigate their teenage years, their 20s, their entire adult lives knowing their sister had been taken and no one had been held accountable. Family gatherings were never the same. There was always an empty chair, always someone missing from the photos, always that unspoken heaviness hanging over everything. But the Zarzyckis weren't the only ones haunted by Cindy's disappearance. The entire community of Eastpointe felt it. Parents who'd once let their kids roam freely became vigilant, protective, paranoid. The innocence of that small-town suburb evaporated. People locked their doors. They walked their kids to school. They didn't let them go anywhere alone. Cindy's case became a cautionary tale whispered among mothers at grocery stores and fathers at Little League games. Remember what happened to the Zarzycki girl? That could be any of our kids. Every year on the anniversary of Cindy's disappearance, April 20th, the community held a vigil. At first, hundreds showed up. Friends, neighbors, classmates, strangers who'd been moved by the story. They'd gather at a local park, light candles, and stand in silence, remembering a girl who'd never had the chance to grow up. As the years passed, the crowds grew smaller. People moved away. Memories faded. New tragedies took center stage. But the Zarzyckis were always there. Every single year. Catherine, Ron, and their remaining children, standing in the cold Michigan spring air, holding candles, refusing to let Cindy be forgotten. Local reporters would show up occasionally, especially on milestone anniversaries. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Still no answers in the disappearance of Cynthia Zarzycki. The segments would air, and for a brief moment, people would remember. Tips would trickle in, detectives would follow up, and inevitably, they'd lead nowhere. But the detectives working Cindy's case, or rather, the rotating roster of detectives who inherited it over the years, never closed the file. In law enforcement, cold cases don't just sit in a dusty archive. They're revisited. New detectives take fresh looks. Advances in technology open new possibilities. In the 1,990 seconds, DNA technology became a game changer for cold cases. Detectives pulled Cindy's file, hoping maybe, just maybe, there was some piece of physical evidence they could retest. But there wasn't. No body meant no DNA. No crime scene meant no physical evidence to analyze. The advancements that were solving decades-old murders across the country couldn't help Cindy, not without her remains. Still, detectives kept Ream on their radar. And Ream? He kept living his life. Throughout the late 1,980 seconds and into the 1,990 seconds, Arthur Ream continued to work odd jobs around Macomb County. He kept a low profile, stayed out of major trouble, and to the outside world, appeared to be just another middle-aged man scraping by. But law enforcement was watching, and what they saw was disturbing. In 1989, a teenage girl reported that a man matching Ream's description had approached her outside a mall, asking if she needed a ride. She refused and reported it. Police questioned Ream. He denied it. Without evidence, nothing came of it. In 1991, Ream was questioned again after a woman reported seeing him watching children at a park. Same story, same outcome, no charges. In 1995, police were called when Ream was spotted near a middle school. At dismissal time, he claimed he was waiting for a friend. No law was broken. He was sent on his way. Each incident was documented. Each one added to the growing file that painted a picture of a predator who'd learned to stay just inside the boundaries of the law. Detectives wanted desperately to nail him for something, anything that would put him behind bars, not just for Cindy, but to stop him from hurting anyone else. Because the terrifying question that haunted investigators was this: had Ream killed before? Had he killed again? There were other missing girls in Michigan during that time, other unsolved cases. Detectives cross-referenced, looking for patterns, connections, similarities. In 1990, a 2-year-old girl went missing in Warren, Michigan, just a few miles from where Cindy disappeared. Her body was never found. Ream was questioned. He had no solid alibi, but there was no evidence linking him to her disappearance either. In 1997, another case. A 4-year-old girl vanished from Sterling Heights. Again, Ream's name came up. Again, nothing concrete. Were these Ream's victims too? Or was it just tragic coincidence? No one knew for sure. But the possibility that Ream had destroyed multiple families gnawed at investigators. Then, in 2008, something shifted. Arthur Ream, now 60 years old, was arrested. Not for Cindy's murder. Not yet. He was arrested for the kidnapping and assault of a different girl. A survivor. In the summer of 2008, Ream had approached a young woman, tried to lure her into his van. She fought back. She escaped. And this time, there were witnesses. This time, there was evidence. Ream was arrested, charged, and convicted. He was sentenced to prison, and for the first time in 22 years, the detectives working Cindy's case saw an opportunity. Ream was going to prison. He was looking at serious time. And prisoners facing long sentences sometimes make deals. The lead detective on Cindy's case at that point was a man named Donald Schell. He'd inherited the file years earlier and had become obsessed with solving it. He'd read every interview transcript. He'd walked the neighborhoods. He'd studied Ream's patterns. Schell knew this was his shot. With Ream, behind bars, vulnerable, facing the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison, Schell approached him with a proposition. Tell us where Cindy is, and we'll talk to the prosecutor. Maybe we can work something out. At first, Ream refused. He played dumb. I don't know what you're talking about. But Schell was patient. He visited Ream multiple times. He built a rapport, such as it was. He appealed to whatever humanity might still exist in Ream. Her family deserves to bury her, Arthur. You know that. You can give them that. And slowly, painfully, slowly, Ream began to crack. He started dropping hints, vague references, testing the waters to see what kind of deal he could get. Hypothetically, if I knew where a body was, what would that be worth to you? Schell stayed calm. He didn't push too hard. He let Ream feel like he was in control. That would be worth a lot, Arthur. That would mean closure for a family that's been suffering for over 20 years. More meetings, more negotiations. And finally, in late 2008, Arthur Ream made an offer. I'll take you to her, but I want something in return. Detectives and prosecutors huddled. Deals with murderers are messy, morally complicated, and often infuriating. But sometimes, they're necessary. Because after 22 years, the Zarzycki family deserved to bring Cindy home. A deal was struck. Ream would lead investigators to Cindy's remains. In exchange, certain considerations would be made regarding his sentencing. On a cold autumn day in 2008, Arthur Ream was taken out of prison in handcuffs. Detectives, forensic teams, and cadaver dogs assembled. Ream directed them to a wooded area in Macomb Township, the same area detectives had searched more than 2 decades earlier. The same area Ream had visited repeatedly during those late-night drives. He'd been checking on her all along. And now, finally, he was going to show them where he'd buried Cynthia Zarzycki. I need to pause here for just a moment. 22 years. Imagine waiting that long for answers. Imagine being Ron and Catherine Zarzycki, waking up every single day not knowing where your child is, and then finally getting a call from detectives saying they might have found her. This is the part of the story where everything changes. But before we get to the breakthrough that finally cracked this case wide open and brought Cindy home, I want to ask you to do something. Share this video. I know that sounds like just another call to action, but hear me out. Someone in your life might be into true crime and not know about this channel yet. Someone might need to hear Cindy's story, because stories like this matter. They remind us that victims are real people, not just headlines. They remind us that justice, even when it's delayed, is still worth fighting for. Also, and I'm genuinely curious about this, what's the weather like where you are right now? Is it raining, sunny, snowing, stormy? I know it seems random, but I love getting a sense of where this community is tuning in from and what your world looks like right now. Drop it in the comments. All right, let's get back to it, because what happened next after 22 years of silence, 22 years of secrets, was both the answer the Zarzycki family had been praying for and the confirmation of their worst nightmare. Arthur Ream was finally ready to talk, and what he revealed would haunt everyone involved. November 2008. After 22 years, 7 months, and 11 days, Arthur Ream was finally ready to give up his secret. But he wasn't doing it out of guilt. He wasn't doing it because his conscience had finally caught up with him. Arthur Ream was doing it because he had something to gain. Ream was already serving time for the assault and attempted kidnapping that had finally put him behind bars earlier that year. He was 60 years old, facing the reality that he'd likely die in prison. And for men like Ream, men who value control above all else, that reality is unbearable. So when Detective Donald Schell approached him with the possibility of a deal, Ream saw an opportunity, not to make amends, not to ease the suffering of the Zarzycki family, but to negotiate, to regain some small measure of control in a life that was rapidly slipping away from him. The meetings between Schell and Ream took place over several weeks in the fall of 2008. Schell would drive to the correctional facility where Ream was being held, sit across from him in a cold, fluorescent-lit room, and try to extract information from a man who'd spent over 2 decades perfecting the art of saying nothing. At first, Ream played games. "I might know something about that girl who went missing back in the 80s, he'd say, almost casually. "But I'd need to know what's in it for me." Schell kept his emotions in check. He wanted to reach across that table and shake Ream until he talked. But that's not how this works. You can't force a confession out of someone who holds all the leverage. So Schell played along. "Tell me what you know, Arthur. Help us find Cindy, and we'll see what we can do." Ream leaned back, considering. "I want guarantees. I want something in writing." Prosecutors were brought in. Negotiations began. It was a delicate, infuriating dance. Ream wanted assurances about his sentencing. He wanted certain charges dropped or reduced. He wanted to make sure that anything he said wouldn't be used against him in ways he hadn't agreed to. The legal system doesn't like making deals with murderers, but sometimes it's the only way to bring a victim home. After days of back and forth, a deal was reached. Ream would lead investigators to Cindy's burial site. He would provide details about what happened to her, and in exchange, prosecutors would make certain considerations regarding his sentencing on the current charges. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was something. On a gray, overcast morning in mid-November 2008, Arthur Ream was escorted out of prison in handcuffs and leg shackles. Detectives, forensic specialists, cadaver dog handlers, and members of the Macomb County Sheriff's Office assembled for what they hoped would be the final chapter of a 22-year nightmare. Ream was loaded into an unmarked police vehicle. Detective Schell sat in the back with him. Other vehicles followed a convoy of law enforcement, all converging on the moment they'd been waiting decades for. Before they left, Ream had drawn maps, detailed maps, crude sketches showing roads, landmarks, and a specific wooded area in Macomb Township. Schell studied those maps carefully. He'd seen this area before. It was the same place Ream had visited during those late-night drives in the years after Cindy disappeared. The same place detectives had searched multiple times and come up empty. "Why didn't we find her before, Arthur?" Schell asked. Ream smiled faintly. "Because I'm good at what I do." It was chilling. No remorse, no shame, just cold, calculated pride. The drive north from the prison took about 45 minutes. The convoy moved in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. For the detectives, this was vindication, proof that they'd been right all along. But it was also heartbreak, because finding Cindy meant confirming what everyone had feared for over 2 decades. She was dead. She'd been dead this whole time. As they approached Macomb Township, Ream began giving directions. "Turn here, go about a mile. Then take the dirt road on the right." They followed his instructions, winding through rural roads lined with bare trees. November in Michigan is bleak gray skies, skeletal branches, a cold wind that cuts right through you. The convoy turned onto a narrow dirt road that led into a dense wooded area. It was remote, isolated. The kind of place you'd only go if you knew exactly where you were headed, or if you were hiding something. The vehicle stopped at a clearing. Ream was helped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked around, getting his bearings. "It's been a long time," he said quietly. "But I remember." He led the group into the woods. Detectives followed closely, cameras rolling, every step documented. Forensic teams carried equipment, shovels, ground-penetrating radar, evidence markers. Cadaver dogs strained at their leashes, noses to the ground, trained to detect the scent of human remains even after decades. Ream walked slowly, scanning the trees, the terrain. He stopped occasionally, as if trying to recall details that had been buried along with his victim. "This way," he said, pointing toward a thicket of brush and overgrown vegetation. The team pushed through. branches scraping against their jackets, boots sinking into soft, damp earth, and then Ream stopped. He stood in a small clearing, looking down at the ground. "Here," he said simply. "She's right here." Detective Shell felt his heart pound in his chest. After 22 years, this was it. "You're sure?" Shell asked. Ream nodded. "I'm sure." Forensic teams moved in immediately. They marked off the area, set up a grid, and began the painstaking process of excavation. Ream was escorted back to one of the vehicles, his part in this done. He sat in the back seat, staring out the window, expressionless. The digging began. It's not like the movies. You don't just plunge a shovel into the ground and uncover a body. Excavating a burial site, especially one that's decades old, is meticulous, slow, and emotionally exhausting work. Investigators worked in layers, carefully removing soil, sifting through dirt, watching for any sign of remains or evidence. Hours passed. The temperature dropped. The sky grew darker, and then one of the forensic techs called out, "We've got something." Everyone stopped. Shell walked over, his breath visible in the cold air. There, just beneath the surface, partially obscured by decades of soil and decay, was a piece of fabric, then bone, then more fabric. Cindy. After 22 years, they'd found her. The mood was somber. No one celebrated. No one felt victorious. This was the moment they'd worked toward for over 2 decades, but it wasn't a moment of triumph. It was heartbreak. Forensic teams continued their work with even greater care now. Every piece of evidence had to be preserved. Every bone had to be recovered. Cindy deserved to be brought home whole. As the excavation continued, Ream sat in the vehicle, watching from a distance. A detective approached him. "You've been coming back here all these years, haven't you?" the detective asked. Ream didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, he said, "I wanted to make sure she was still here, that no one had found her." It was monstrous. For 22 years, while Cindy's family grieved, while they held vigils, while they begged for answers, Arthur Ream had been visiting her grave, checking on her, making sure his secret stayed buried. But secrets don't stay buried forever. By late afternoon, the excavation was complete. Cindy's remains were carefully placed in a body bag and transported to the medical examiner's office for identification and analysis. DNA testing would confirm what everyone already knew. After 8,042 days, Cynthia Zarzycki was finally coming home. Detective Shell had one more task to complete, the hardest one. He drove to the Zarzycki home and knocked on the door. Catherine answered. She saw his face and knew immediately. "You found her?" she whispered. Shell nodded, his eyes red. "We found her, Mrs. Zarzycki. We're bringing Cindy home." Catherine collapsed into her husband's arms. Ron held her tight, tears streaming down his face. It was the call they'd been waiting for. The call they'd prayed for. But it was also the confirmation of their worst nightmare. Cindy had been out there all along, buried in the cold Michigan earth, while they'd spent 22 years hoping she was somehow still alive. The relief of finally knowing was eclipsed by the agony of what they now knew. Their daughter had been dead for over 2 decades, and the man who killed her had walked free for 22 years, living his life, while they'd lived in hell. But now, finally, Arthur Ream was going to face justice, not just for taking Cindy's life, but for stealing 22 years from her family. The wooded area where Cindy Zarzycki was found is the kind of place most people would never notice. It's off a dirt road in Macomb Township, about 20 miles north of Eastpointe. Dense trees, thick underbrush. The kind of isolated spot where you could be standing 10 feet away from something and never see it. It was the perfect hiding place, and Arthur Ream had known that when he buried her there in April 1986. The forensic team worked for hours that cold November day in 2008, carefully excavating the site. Every shovelful of dirt was examined. Every fragment was documented. This wasn't just a recovery, it was a crime scene, even after 22 years. Cindy's remains were found approximately 3 feet below the surface. Time and the elements had taken their toll, but enough remained for investigators to piece together the horror of what had happened. She'd been wrapped in something fabric that had long since deteriorated, but traces remained. Ream had tried to hide her, to make sure she'd never be found, and for 22 years, he'd succeeded. The medical examiner would later confirm through dental records and DNA analysis what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains were those of Cynthia Marie Zarzycki, 13 years old, missing since the 20th of April 1986, finally found, finally coming home. For the investigators who'd spent years, some of them decades, working this case, the discovery was bittersweet. They'd been right all along. Arthur Ream was the killer. He'd taken Cindy's life, buried her in those woods, and then spent over 2 decades pretending he knew nothing. But being right doesn't feel good when you're standing over the remains of a child who should have grown up, lived a full life, had a future. Detective Shell stood at the site long after the excavation was complete, staring at the ground where Cindy had been hidden for so long. He thought about all the times they'd searched this area, all the times they'd been so close but hadn't found her. All the years the Zarzycki family had suffered, not knowing. Other detectives wept, some openly, some turned away so no one would see. These are men and women who'd seen the worst humanity has to offer, who'd worked homicides, assaults, unspeakable crimes. But something about a case like Cindy's, a child taken, a family destroyed, decades of unanswered questions, hits differently. You carry those cases with you, forever. Back at the Zarzycki home, Catherine and Ron sat in stunned silence after Detective Shell delivered the news. 22 years of hoping, praying, searching, and now it was over. Cindy was gone. She'd been gone this whole time, but at least now they knew. At least now they could bring her home. At least now they could lay her to rest. Catherine's first question was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Did she suffer? Shell chose his words carefully. The truth was, they didn't know all the details yet. The medical examiner would have to determine cause of death, and after 22 years, that wouldn't be easy. But Shell knew what Catherine needed to hear. We're going to find out everything we can, Mrs. Zarzycki. We're going to make sure we know exactly what happened. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the only one he could give. Ron asked the question that had haunted him for over 2 decades. Was it Ream? Shell nodded. Yes, sir. It was Ream. He led us to her, and we're going to make sure he pays for what he did. Ron's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. For 22 years, he'd known deep down. He'd known that Arthur Ream had taken his daughter, and now, it was confirmed. The man who'd walked past him in grocery stores, who'd driven through the same neighborhoods, who'd lived a normal life while the Zarzyckis lived in hell, that man had murdered Cindy and hidden her body for over 2 decades. The family wanted to see her, to be there when she was brought home. But Shell gently explained that wasn't possible. Not yet. Cindy's remains had to be processed, examined, analyzed. It was evidence now, part of a murder investigation. There would be time for a funeral, time to say goodbye. But first, justice had to be served. News of the discovery spread quickly through Eastpointe and the surrounding communities. After 22 years, Cindy Zarzycki had been found. Local news stations ran breaking news alerts. Reporters descended on the wooded area where Cindy had been recovered. Cameras captured the police tape, the forensic vehicles, the somber faces of investigators leaving the scene. The community that had held vigils for Cindy every year felt a collective wave of grief and relief. She'd been found. Finally. But the cost of that discovery was the confirmation that she'd been dead all along. That every vigil, every prayer, every flicker of hope that maybe somehow she was still alive had been in vain. At the next vigil, held just weeks after Cindy was found, the crowd was larger than it had been in years. People came to mourn, to remember, to stand in solidarity with a family that had endured the unimaginable. Catherine Zarzycki stood before the crowd, holding a candle, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. Thank you for never forgetting her. Thank you for keeping her memory alive. We can finally bring our baby home. The crowd stood in silence, candles flickering in the November wind. After 22 years, Cindy Zarzycki was no longer missing. But the fight for justice was just beginning. On the 16th of December 2008, less than a month after Cindy's remains were recovered, Arthur Ream was formally charged with first-degree murder. He stood in court, shackled, wearing an orange jumpsuit, as the charges were read aloud. The people of the state of Michigan versus Arthur Ream, count 1, first-degree premeditated murder, in the death of Cynthia Marie Zarzycki. Ream showed no emotion, no fear, no remorse. He stood there as if he were being charged with a parking ticket, not the brutal murder of a child. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. The legal battle had begun. Prosecutors knew this case would be challenging. 22 years had passed. Physical evidence was limited. There was no murder weapon, No witnesses to the actual crime. No confession, at least not a full one. What they did have was Ream's own actions. He'd led police to Cindy's body. He'd drawn maps. He'd provided details only the killer would know. That was damning. But would it be enough? The prosecution team, led by Assistant Macomb County Prosecutor William Cataldo, spent months building their case. They reviewed every piece of evidence collected over 22 years. They re-interviewed witnesses. They brought in forensic experts to testify about the remains and the burial site. They also focused on Ream's history, his pattern of behavior, his obsession with young girls, the decades of suspicious activity that had kept him on law enforcement's radar. The trial began in the spring of 2010. The courtroom was packed. Members of the Zarzycki family sat in the front row. Catherine, Ron, Cindy's siblings, extended family. They'd waited 24 years for this moment. 24 years to see the man who'd destroyed their lives held accountable. Behind them sat members of the community, retired detectives who'd worked the case, reporters, and citizens who'd followed Cindy's story for decades. Arthur Ream sat at the defense table, expressionless, occasionally whispering to his attorney. The prosecution's opening statement was powerful. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in April 1986, a 13-year-old girl named Cindy Zarzycki left her home to walk to a nearby store. She never made it. For 22 years, her family didn't know what happened to her. They didn't know where she was. They didn't know if she was alive or dead. But one man knew. One man knew the entire time. And that man is sitting right there, Arthur Ream. Cataldo pointed directly at Ream. He took her life. He buried her body. He hid his crime for over 2 decades. And when he finally decided to reveal what he'd done, it wasn't out of guilt or remorse, it was because he wanted something in return. But justice doesn't negotiate. And today, we're here to make sure Arthur Ream finally pays for what he did. The defense's opening was predictable. They argued that leading police to a body didn't prove Ream had killed anyone. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested that Ream might have known where the body was, for reasons other than murder. It was weak. And everyone in that courtroom knew it. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution called witness after witness. Detectives testified about the initial investigation, Ream's suspicious behavior, the years of surveillance. Forensic experts testified about the burial site, the condition of the remains, and the evidence that Cindy had been intentionally hidden. The medical examiner testified about cause of death. Due to the condition of the remains, a definitive cause couldn't be determined, but the manner of death was ruled a homicide. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Ream's own maps. Prosecutors displayed blown-up versions for the jury, detailed sketches showing roads, landmarks, and an X marking where Cindy was buried. Why would Arthur Ream have maps like this unless he put her there? Cataldo asked the jury. The defense had no good answer. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for and dreading. Victim impact statements. Catherine Zarzycki took the stand. She was older now, grayer, worn down by decades of grief, but her voice was steady as she spoke directly to the jury. Cindy was my daughter. She was 13 years old. She loved music. She loved her friends. She had her whole life ahead of her. And that man, she pointed at Ream, took all of that away. He didn't just kill my daughter. He stole 22 years from our family, 22 years of not knowing, 22 years of hoping she'd come home, 22 years of living in hell. Her voice broke. Tears streamed down her face. I will never get those years back. I will never get to see Cindy graduate high school, go to college, get married, have children. He took all of that. And I will never forgive him. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Ron Zarzycki spoke next. His statement was shorter, but no less powerful. I spent 22 years searching for my daughter. 22 years driving the same streets, hoping for a miracle. And the whole time, he knew where she was. He watched us suffer, and he didn't care. Ron turned to face Ream directly. I hope you rot in prison for what you did. Ream stared straight ahead. No reaction. No remorse. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberation took less than a day. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find? We find the defendant, Arthur Ream, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Catherine Zarzycki sobbed. Ron held her close. Family members embraced. Detectives who'd worked the case for years allowed themselves to feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. Victory. Arthur Ream was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced once at the Zarzycki family. Still no remorse, still no emotion. Just a cold, empty stare. But it didn't matter anymore. After 24 years, justice had finally been served. Arthur Ream entered the Michigan Department of Corrections in 2010 as inmate #762417, life in prison without parole. He was 62 years old, barring a successful appeal, which his attorneys attempted and failed. He would die behind bars. For the Zarzycki family, the conviction brought a measure of closure. But closure doesn't erase 24 years of trauma. It doesn't bring back the daughter and sister they lost. It doesn't undo the damage. Catherine and Ron finally held a funeral for Cindy, a proper burial, a headstone with her name, her dates, and a simple inscription: forever loved, never forgotten, never forgotten. The funeral was attended by hundreds: family, friends, classmates who were now in their 40s, detectives who'd worked the case, community members who'd kept Cindy's memory alive for over 2 decades. It was a moment of mourning, yes, but also a moment of closure that the Zarzyckis had been denied for far too long. Catherine stood at the graveside, holding a single white rose, and finally said the goodbye she'd been unable to say for 24 years. Rest now, baby. You're home. But even with the conviction, questions lingered. Had Ream killed others? During his time in prison, investigators from multiple jurisdictions reached out, hoping he might confess to other unsolved cases. There were other missing girls, other cold cases with similarities to Cindy's disappearance. Detectives visited Ream in prison. They asked about other victims. They showed him photos. They offered deals if he'd come clean. Ream refused. He gave vague answers. He hinted at things without confirming anything. It was the same manipulative behavior he'd exhibited for decades. If Arthur Ream had other victims, he took those secrets with him. In interviews, rare as they were, Ream never expressed genuine remorse. He'd occasionally say things like, "I'm sorry for what the family went through," but it always felt hollow, performative. He never once said, "I'm sorry I killed Cindy." Psychologists who studied his case suggested Ream was a narcissist with sociopathic tendencies. He lacked empathy. He saw people, especially young girls, as objects to control, manipulate, and discard. Cindy wasn't a person to him. She was a victim, a conquest, a secret to keep. Even in prison, Ream maintained a disturbing sense of pride in what he'd done. He'd evaded capture for 22 years. He'd outsmarted detectives. He'd hidden a body so well that multiple searches failed to find it. To him, that was an accomplishment. It made him a monster. In the years following his conviction, Ream's health declined. Prison life is hard on elderly inmates. He developed medical issues. He spent time in the prison infirmary. On the 9th of June 2018, 8 years after his conviction, Arthur Ream died in custody at the age of 70. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. There was no fanfare, no headlines, just a brief notation in the Department of Corrections records. Inmate #762417, deceased. When the Zarzycki family was notified, their reaction was complicated. Relief that he was gone, that he could never hurt anyone else, that he'd spent his final years behind bars, stripped of freedom and control, but also frustration. Because Ream had taken so much to the grave. If there were other victims, their families would never get the closure the Zarzyckis had fought so hard to achieve. Ron Zarzycki said it best in an interview after Ream's death. "I'm glad he's gone, but I wish he'd lived long enough to tell the truth about everything he did." If there are other families out there still searching, they deserve answers too. Cindy's case left a lasting impact on law enforcement in Michigan. It reinforced the importance of never giving up on cold cases, of keeping files active, of continuing to follow leads even when decades have passed. Detective Donald Schell, who'd been instrumental in finally bringing Ream to justice, said in an interview, "Cindy's case taught us that persistence pays off. That even when it seems hopeless, you keep pushing. You keep investigating. Because families deserve answers, and victims deserve justice no matter how long it takes." Today, Cindy's case is studied in law enforcement training programs as an example of cold case investigation done right. Her story is a reminder that some cases are never truly cold. They're just waiting for the right moment, the right break, the right investigator who refuses to give up. Arthur Ream thought he'd gotten away with murder, For 22 years, he did, but in the end, justice caught up with him, and Cindy Zarzycki's name will be remembered long after his is forgotten.